So there's nothing in the law that says the president can do this, and the power of this classification and the definition of it is not set by the president. It's set by Congress.
That's the voice of Alex Wellerstein, an associate professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology and author of the book Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plasters Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, great to see you. How was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. Great to see you. My weekend was so much fun. I went up to upstate New York for a beautiful wedding. So congratulations to Ian and Risa. Tom, how was your weekend? I know you did some traveling.
It was great, thanks. Yes, I started in New Hampshire, drove down to Great Barrington to visit my mom, then to Philly to visit my kids, and now I am back in D.C. So it was a lot of driving, but lots of fun.
Well, I'm glad that you made it safely and that you got to spend some time with your family. So on to your favorite question to be asked on a Monday morning. What do you have for us this week on nuclear news?
On Iran, we may be, with an emphasis on may be, inching closer to a revival of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Last week, the European Union sent its final, in quotes, proposal to Iran and to the United States. The Biden administration said it was reviewing the text, and the EU's foreign policy chief said Iran's response to the proposal was, quote, reasonable. Over the weekend, President Biden spoke with leaders of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom to discuss the ongoing negotiations. So we may be getting a decision soon, fingers crossed. More on this later in the show. On Ukraine, President Biden and Western leaders on Sunday stressed the need for the United Nations nuclear watchdog to visit the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in southeastern Ukraine, where shelling has sparked fears of a radioactive disaster. The leaders reiterated the need to avoid military operations near the nuclear plant. And last week, the Pentagon announced that it will send another $775 million worth of missiles, drones, vehicles, and mine-clearing equipment to Ukraine. Finally, on the Korean Peninsula, this week, South Korea and the United States began their largest joint military drill in years, as South Korea heightens its defense posture against North Korea. Of course, as listeners know, Washington and Seoul see their military exercises as defensive, but the North sees them as a threat and uses them to justify the development of its nuclear and missile programs. Lauren, what do you have for us this week on early warning?
This week, Alex Hall sat down with Laura Rozen, member of the editorial board of Just Security and writer of the diplomatic substack newsletter. They discussed the latest developments to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and the U.S. and Iran's responses to the new EU proposal.
And then I sit down with Alex Wellerstein. He is the author of Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States. We discuss the FBI's recent search of former President Trump's house for classified documents, what kind of nuclear secrets may be involved, and whether Trump could face prosecution. It's a great conversation on a breaking issue, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Just about 2 weeks ago, the European Union provided a so-called final text to the U.S. and Iran to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran nuclear deal. To update us on what has happened since, I am joined by Laura Rozen, member of the editorial board of Just Security and writer of the diplomatic substack newsletter. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
So what did the E3 put on the table?
So the E3 put on the table a revision of the draft that's basically been done since March. All of us were watching Vienna in late February, early March, when it seemed like they were very close to getting a deal. I actually went over there, and then the war with Russia started, and there were some final gaps that the parties couldn't overcome. So in late July, you saw EU High Rep Joseph Borrell wrote a very powerful op-ed at the Financial Times saying, "We've exhausted the negotiations. I'm putting on the table a final text. And I think it's time for the parties to say yes." So they come together in Vienna early in the month. with the Iranians, the US in the other room. The Russians and Chinese sent reps. The E3 did not, saying that their work was done. The E3 are the three European countries who are party to the deal. They were there for a few days and came up with a 35-page, really final draft text that they wanted the parties to have a few weeks to say yes, hopefully yes on. And the Iranians left and came back last Monday, August 15th. Really, it was quite a change, because the sense that many of us had was that, they were not very enthusiastic, and that they didn't seem ready to move forward for a lot of the summer. And some of the demands, I understand that, the US thought they brought to an earlier meeting in Doha in June were so excessive, it was almost like they knew it was going to be rejected. So suddenly last Monday, August 15th, you saw the Iran foreign minister briefing journalists in Tehran saying, we're sending our answer back to the EU by midnight. And there was sort of just a whole new level of a sense that Iran was very ready to move forward. And they sent their text by midnight. The EU said they got it. The US said they got the Iranian comments by Tuesday last week. And they all week last week were saying, we're studying it. And it was clear they were seriously, going over what Iran had been asking, some changes to the final text, which Iran clearly is trying to get a little more. And my understanding and reports have suggested that what Iran was asking for, which is interesting, is they were no longer asking that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, get taken off a US terror blacklist, which had been a problem for the Biden administration. They seem to have resolved this issue about IAEA safeguards during parallel negotiations in Vienna a couple of weeks back. They have some solution whereby Iran would answer the questions that the IAEA wants, and then they were assured that if they do that, then the probe would be closed. It would not be an endless kind of witch hunt. So they're asking, guarantee type issues about if certain deals go through during the Biden administration while Iran is implementing the deal, that, those would at least last through the Biden administration. Reporting suggests that maybe they want some things more clarified in writing on the sanctions lifting type issue. So it was something within the realm I think the US could seriously consider.
What are you hearing about how the US may reply right now?
So unfortunately, we had been kind of expecting every day in the EU, there had been a sort of sense that the US might respond by Friday, then Saturday, over the weekend. Sunday, we saw there was a call between Biden and his counterparts from the 3 European nations to the deal. Israeli National Security Advisor was already expected to come to DC Tuesday. So it's not clear to me if the US is maybe going to give him the courtesy of consulting with him in person before they send their response. We're speaking on Monday morning, and we're still getting a little bit of information of what went on over the weekend. There were a couple US official comments that I think CNN reported, which was, we're closer than we were 2 weeks ago, but there are still gaps. So I think what they were publicly signaling is the answer is not going to be no, but it may not be a flat yes. It seems like they're signaling that, they're going to say, we can do this and this, we can't do this and this, or, maybe something in between. So I would not be surprised if the US sends a response and then maybe there's some back and forth. That would be something that would seem not something crazy to speculate about. I guess I would be surprised if it was a flat no. It wouldn't take so long. They don't seem to have another policy. So I imagine it's going to be something that Iran can work with.
So given that, are we up against any sort of external timelines, and how are domestic events in both Iran and the US maybe affecting the timeline of these negotiations?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And so I think the fact that Iran responded in a way that seems serious enough to be given such consideration by the United States and the other parties probably helps relieve a little bit some of the time pressure. There are the meetings around the UN General Assembly and the IAEA Board of Governors meeting in September. So I think the fact that people think Iran's trying to move forward probably helps relieve some of the sense that we're heading off a cliff. I don't know of a particular political event in Iran that is their drop dead date. I do think there's some speculation, I know, in the West about US midterms in November. Biden going to try to stall this out so that he doesn't hurt any Democrats with this. what one person told me, Biden's having a pretty good time. It was pretty strong with the Democrats. The Democrats have a lot to talk about with their accomplishments, and trying to solve the Iran nuclear issue with diplomacy is something that a lot of Democrats support. I don't see Biden stalling this out for political reasons. I think they're just trying to make sure it's a deal that they feel is in the U.S. national security interest that they can live with. There was also speculation over the weekend that, Israeli caretaker Prime Minister Yair Lapid is running for Israeli elections. Israel also has elections in November. Be a little hard for him to say, oh, look, I'm running, and the U.S. just took the deal that a lot of Israelis feel is not tough enough on Iran. So I think, that's something the Israeli National Security Advisor may try to tell the White House about. But I think that for something that's so important for U.S. national security, the Biden administration, they know that Israel is going to have a hard time with it, whether they make the deal last March, in September, in November, and December. And I think he has to take the deal when he thinks the opportunity is there.
Thank you so much, Laura. And as you said, we are recording this on Monday. If developments occur by the time this airs, we will be bringing our listeners more updates. So thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to following this very closely.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
During the August 8th search of Donald Trump's Florida residence, FBI agents were looking for classified documents, including some reportedly related to nuclear weapons. The FBI search set off a political firestorm and has generated heated accusations about whether the search was politically motivated. But just sticking to the facts for a moment, this situation raises a whole host of questions, like, what kind of nuclear secrets are we talking about? Why would President Trump take those documents with him? And can Trump be prosecuted? To help us better understand this, we are being joined today by Alex Wellerstein. He's an associate professor of science and technology studies at the Stevens Institute of Technology, and he's the author of the book on nuclear secrecy. It's called Restricted Data: The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States. Alex, thanks for being here.
I'm really happy to be here, Tom.
So let's get into it. As president, Trump claimed he could declassify pretty much anything he wanted. But is this really true? Aren't nuclear weapons secrets treated in a different way from other national security secrets?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question for two reasons. One is that the president definitely has the power to declassify national defense information, which is the category of everything except nuclear weapons, essentially. So biological weapons, what the Secretary of State ate for dinner yesterday, intelligence information, whatever. That's all national defense information. That's what you think of when you think of confidential, secret, top secret. That's what those correspond to. Even there, it's not clear that he can sort of wave his hand over the documents and just say, these are declassified. I mean, when presidents have done this in the past, they do it by issuing an executive order, by putting something written down. They specify what the documents are. They make sure that that information is known to the people who are controlling these things and thus take it into account, and so on and so on. It's not sort of magical in the way that this defense sounds like. And the reason that the president can do that for that information is because the way in which that classification system is set up, all of the classifying and declassifying power does essentially emanate from the president. But nuclear weapons are different. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 and all of its updates in 1954 and later, they specify that nuclear secrets, specifically all data that's essentially involved in the manufacture, use, or just any technical information about nuclear weapons or nuclear power, are classified as restricted data by default. This is a specialized term. And that the only way to declassify that is for the agency that's in charge of enforcing restricted data controls, which was originally the Atomic Energy Commission, today would be the Department of Energy. They have to declassify it. So there's nothing in the law that says the president can do this. And the power of this classification and the definition of it is not set by the president. It's set by Congress.
So we have these two separate systems, one for general national security information and one for nuclear information. How did we get these two systems? Why do we have these two systems? Why are nuclear documents and information born secret where other things are not?
It's an interesting history. The moment at which this emerged was right after World War II. And there was a lot of argument and discussion about what they called domestic control of atomic energy. How do we run nuclear infrastructure in the United States after the Manhattan Project, after World War II? And there was a lot of sort of legislative back and forth in which originally the War Department, so the military essentially, what's now the Department of Defense, they tried to sort of push through a draft of a law that they claimed needed to be put in place immediately. And if it didn't go in place immediately, we would be committing national suicide. This is the specific term. And this law basically gave this new organization that would be taking over from the Manhattan Project the ability to make really broad secrecy classifications. They'd be able to sort of issue classification over anything. And the scientists at the time, both those who had worked on the Manhattan Project and others, really pushed back against this. And they said, you will destroy science if you do this. And there were also people who did not want the government to have the power, this sort of new agency, to have this power to sort of classify the whole world. So the result of this is that law got thrown into the trash can. A new law got put on the books, sponsored by a new special committee that was evaluating this question. And the initial draft of this is called the McMahon Act. The initial draft of this had almost no secrecy in it whatsoever. It was really just saying that science was essentially not secret. Maybe the specifics of your individual atomic bombs might be secret, but not the sort of underlying information. So the one way to think about it's like the concept of a tank isn't classified, but the specifics of an M1 Abrams probably is, right? That would be the approach they would have taken. And the scientists were very happy with this, but the military thought this was not going to be sufficient. And so what happened is it's kind of a bizarre set of events. It's an interesting story, and it's important to see how rooted this is in sort of like early 1946. General Groves leaked to the press an account of a Soviet spy that had been caught in Canada. This was a very minor early spy. This is the Guzenko affair. It's not the later spies. It's not the Rosenberg. It's not Klaus Fuchs. This is a very minor spy incident. But it sort of became the first wave of spy hysteria about the atomic bomb. The McMahon Committee, after this, went back and revised the bill that they had put out. And instead of being this sort of pro-science, they had a whole section called dissemination of information that was about how important it was going to be to make this information free. And they crossed that out and replaced it with a section called control of information. And it was about how they had to control all of it. And so they created this bizarre restricted data construction for sort of two reasons. One is that they weren't sure that the Espionage Act, which is what kind of governs other secrets, was enough to guarantee that sort of data, scientific information could be kept controlled. This was a category that the Espionage Act didn't cover, and they wanted it covered. And the other concern was that they still didn't want the system where this new agency could just create secrecy that would sort of reach out everywhere. But they also wanted it to have a lot of power. So what they essentially did was say, everything in this topic is automatically secret by default by statute. And all this agency can do is remove things from that category, which is a very bizarre compromise to sort of say we're afraid of government overreach. So we're going to define, we Congress are going to say that the government has sort of not quite infinite power, but in this area, sort of total control. And the only thing it can do, this is the words of McMahon, is reduce the scope of the crime. So it's a very strange setup that is really specific to 1945, 1946, when it was really unclear what the future was going to be. They were starting to get afraid of spies. The Cold War is starting to emerge as a dynamic in people's minds. There's still a lot of uncertainty of which way to go. And they end up putting this very bizarre legal construction in the law, and it has stayed in law since then.
Now, let's talk a little bit about what Trump might have in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, we don't know is the short answer, what Trump might have. But give us a sense of how serious this might be. Why is there so much concern about this?
So we don't really have a great sense of what he has. The most evocative information we have at the moment is information that the FBI released regarding its search warrant, which did list some of the classification categories of some of the documents, which some of them went up pretty high. None of those indicated restricted data, but that doesn't mean restricted data couldn't be in the documents or they just didn't list it. Who knows? There's also nuclear secrets that might not be restricted data in the sense of being related to nuclear weapons, but not be strictly restricted data. So, for example, let's imagine they had foreign intelligence that would tell them that the Iranians could have a nuclear weapon at this time if they did some policy. That might not fall under restricted data if it's not really about the actual weapons itself, but it would still be, material related to nuclear weapons. What could be in here? I mean, really almost anything. The universe of possible classified things is so much vaster than I think most people realize. Scholar Peter Gallison once calculated that more classified information is generated every year than unclassified information in terms of published information. If you look at like how many books are published versus how many classified memos are developed, the classified memos outweigh the books in terms of pages any day of the week. If you look at what has been secret in the past, it gives you a sense that the FBI had an investigation into whether the song Louie Louie it was vulgar. This was a secret investigation. It generated several hundred pages of secret documents, right? Like this is what I mean by the universe of this is vast. And the universe of this regard to nuclear weapons is also vast. It's not just how to make an atomic bomb. It's not just North Korea has X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's sort of every aspect of the weapons, their manufacture, their maintenance, any changes, your capabilities, your foreign information. The universe is sort of whatever. So you could imagine that it's nothing. You could imagine that every document he has is very boring and totally uninteresting, though some of these classification levels are clearly indicating that somebody didn't think they were. Or you could imagine that he's got sort of the crown jewels in here that are going to have huge impacts. The range is sort of whatever you want it to be.
And what does it tell you, if anything, the way the Justice Department handled this, right, with this immediate search and seizure? Does that tell you anything about the seriousness of the documents?
Well, they clearly did not feel that these were being properly handled or in the right place. And their legal responsibility, if they find out there are classified documents outside of classified controls, they have to go get them. There isn't a discretionary aspect. Prosecution might be discretionary, but like that's their job. And it's the same thing with, the Department of Energy and restricted data. They are required to regulate this stuff. They can be in trouble if they don't regulate this stuff. So they clearly consider these documents classified. So one obvious aspect that comes out, the Trump defense at the moment, the current defense, I'm sure there will be many more as this goes on, but the current defense is, oh, I had a standing order that made all of this declassified if I took it home with me, so it's not a problem. Which, let's not even ask whether that's true or not, or whether this order exists. That seems sort of irrelevant. If that order did exist and if this was out there, clearly the FBI and the Justice Department did not know about it. Clearly nobody had told them that he was only holding on to declassified documents, because they would not have gone off and raided to get it. So if this existed, it was a secret declassification, which is just a sort of bizarre contradiction of terms. They clearly didn't think that this was the case.
Any thoughts you might have on why President Trump would want to take this information with him?
I've seen speculation ranging from, the people who think he's trying to sell it to other nations to the people who think he's trying to keep it for souvenirs and selling it to somebody else. I mean, most of the theories are that he sees some monetary benefit in these documents because that appears to be the primary way in which he evaluates whether or not to do anything. And it does appear that, he was in contact with the FBI, and his people were, about returning other classified documents, and that these are the documents not returned. So it's not like he was unaware that this was a concern or an issue. It wasn't like he accidentally retained some documents. Now, it's possible maybe he tried to give away a lot and a few were left over. It doesn't sound like that. I mean, even his own defenses make it sound like that is clearly not the position they're taking. He claims that the FBI told him to put a padlock on the door, which, I mean, this sounds very inadequate, and that he happily complied with this, and thus that proves that he could work with the FBI and they didn't have to raid him. I mean, just the fact that this is even happening makes it clear that there's an awareness that the FBI don't want him to have these things and that they're not meant to be had. So I don't know. I mean, it could be mementos. It could be things he wants to brag and show people. It could be, who knows, things he wants to sell off to the highest bidder someday. I mean, let me just say, it's very hard to get inside anybody's head, and getting inside his head has never been easy. And we have all spent a lot of time trying to do it over the last few years. And I don't have any confidence that I can get inside his head and come up with a sensible answer to this. It could just be spite in some ways, right? If he knows that the government wants these documents and he doesn't want to give it back and he wants the confrontation, right? That's the kind of personality he seems to have also. So who knows?
Now, we're all used to outrageous acts from former President Trump, but how outrageous is this? I mean, does this have a precedent? After leaving office, have other presidents taken nuclear documents with them?
If they have, I've never heard of it. I mean, this doesn't sound very precedented to me. There's always the possibility that presidential records are not properly moved around. And there have definitely been cases in which presidents have moved unclassified government documents back into the National Archives' hands. The Obama administration did this. I can't think of any precedent where you have documents of this level of classification and this many of them that were in private hands and then had to be returned. I mean, that's very, very bizarre. The only analogy I was able to think of, presidents running into anything similar, in the 1950s, Harry Truman would tell people sort of stories about nuclear weapons. And apparently, according to somebody who was with him, he would occasionally use one bit of information that was classified. Specifically, he would take pleasure in telling them the atomic bomb got its power from only 13 pounds of fuel, 13 pounds of plutonium, which is something he had been told right after the Trinity test and clearly remained burned in his memory for the rest of his life, this awe at these 13 pounds. And so this actually did result in somebody sending a memo to the FBI, somebody in the government saying, the former president, this is in the 50s after he was out, the former president keeps saying this number. It's technically restricted data. He shouldn't be doing it. Should we tell him? I mean, nobody was contemplating putting him in jail or anything. I think they thought that this was just, he didn't know it was classified and he didn't realize that this was considered pretty sensitive information. And I don't think anything came of that. I think they probably just hoped it would go away. But it's a different situation for a bunch of reasons. One is that Truman probably didn't realize it was classified. It's pretty clear Trump was aware these documents were classified. And also, this is not a situation in which somebody is taking materials of any sort. This is just somebody saying something that is not supposed to be said. It's a tiny bit of information, the number 13, essentially. It's not the same thing as a document labeled top secret or something like that.
So another burning question is, can the former president be prosecuted for his actions here? And I know you're not a lawyer, so full disclosure, you are not a lawyer. But how should we think about this? How do you think about this?
Well, I think there's a lot of unknowns here. This is really pretty unprecedented, like so many things with Trump. I've looked and not found anything where you have a case of a president being accused of hoarding secrets, of declassifying things improperly in this way. If you want to make that argument that that's what he's done, you just don't have that much to go back on in terms of precedent. And certainly there's been no prosecutions of this sort of thing. And so the question would be, if you wanted to prosecute, could you come up with argument for doing it? Sure. I think it's pretty easy to imagine reading, say, the Espionage Act or the Atomic Energy Act as saying, depending on what's in these documents, That's not how it works, that you cannot declassify, especially retroactively when you're no longer president, but like there would have to be a paper trail, right? There would have to be evidence that this happened. Bill Clinton issued an executive order in, I think, 94, where he declassified millions of documents relating to World War II and other things like that. A, there was the executive order that came out and was public, and B, there was a list of documents, many, many, many pages long. And then C, the government was involved with evaluating and making sure what could be released and what couldn't be released for reasons other than national security, like privacy. Like, that's what I mean by documentation. Like that sort of order should be producing these rippling effects that are registering that the order has been made. And it really obviously doesn't seem like that happened with Trump, or else the Justice Department or the FBI would have known about it, presumably. So you could argue that this is just totally inappropriate under the both laws, that even if the president does have the power to declassify, that isn't what happened here. That there's clearly no evidence that that happened, or at least doesn't seem to be. So could you prosecute for that? You could try, but ultimately your success is going to be based on how the courts evaluate this. And what you're really doing here is asking, what is the power of the president? Not only is that unclear in the abstract, it's exceptionally unclear for things like a criminal prosecution, right? And so you're really entering into nebulous constitutional territory. There are no doubt theorists who would get up and say the president essentially does whatever he wants. And if the president is the person who issues the executive orders that govern national defense information, then sure, the president could wave his hands and magically it's declassified and it's not a problem. He doesn't have to tell anybody and he doesn't have to mark the documents. He's exempt from all procedures because he's the president. And there's a lot of people who are going to say that's a king model. That's not a president model. That's not a rule of law model. And whether the courts, and you could imagine this going all the way to the Supreme Court, whether they're going to lean one way or the other is going to depend on their own feelings about the powers of the president. And as we've seen, that varied dramatically over time. So it would be a hard prosecution to make, I imagine, because the uncertainties would just be gigantic. That doesn't mean you couldn't do it, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it. But I mean, you don't have any precedent to fall back on, is what I'm saying.
And it's quite possible, as you said before, that the motivation here of the Justice Department is not prosecution, but simply to get the documents back.
I think at a minimum, that's a sort of base motivation. Whether or not they would prosecute is an entirely separate issue. And usually with mishandling of secrets, you don't try to put the person in jail. Usually it's an administrative resolution. You fire them, you revoke their security clearance, whatever. You can't really do that in this case. You're talking about a former president. Former presidents don't really have that many powers at all. I don't know where this leaves you. It's a very bizarre situation to have a president essentially claiming they have these powers to declassify at will. Usually when it's presidents in secrecy, it's the other problem. It's the president saying, I have the power to make certain things secret at will, not I have the power to make things not secret at will, and to make them not secret secretly, which again, very bizarre construction. The people who set up these classification systems, whether nuclear or non-nuclear, never in their wildest dreams did they imagine this would be the situation. It was just not in the imagination of what could happen. And it's yet one of many similar sorts of issues with Trump, where like clearly this is acting outside of the bounds of any expectation of what could have occurred. And so it's not clear what the way forward is. It's not clear what the options are.
Last question for you, because we're running out of time. Let's expand the aperture here a little bit. Does this raise other issues for you about our different classification systems and how presidents handle secrets?
There's a general question there about whether or not nuclear secrets should be handled differently. Like, is this a good idea? I think a lot of people are sort of looking for the nuclear secrets as a way to definitively keep Trump from wriggling out of yet another sort of thing. And I would say, okay, maybe, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know if there's restricted data in those documents. But the restricted data clause is really weird. It's arguably kind of unconstitutional. The born secret aspects that can apply to anybody and any information, that's a very bizarre sort of construction. And I sort of don't think it's a good piece of law. I think it's ambiguous how it is used and whether it can be used. There really have not been successful prosecutions under that aspect of the law. It's not clear if it's even really something to take into consideration. And I don't want people to think, well, it'd be great to get Trump, so let's have this weird nuclear law. I mean, the weird nuclear law probably should have been folded into a more comprehensive secrecy reform decades ago after the Cold War ended, for sure. And there were some movements in that direction that didn't end up going anywhere. Separately, the way we set things up with classification in general, which does give the president all these powers, like, I don't think that's a very good system personally. I would prefer something more similar to the Atomic Energy Act in the sense that Congress would be the one issuing these regulations. Because what's tended to happen is that different presidents radically change how classification works, whether leaning towards more classification or less classification, more presumption of openness versus not. And that's one of those things that I feel like shouldn't be a sort of partisan whim. I feel like that should be something that requires a real process, and a law would be a way to do that. But we have this old system that dates from basically World War II of these executive orders. Interestingly, and sort of surprising to me, Trump never issued one of those. So almost every president before him issued their own updated way to think about secrecy and classification, declassification. And I was fully waiting his whole tenure for him to replace the Obama era one, just because he replaces all Obama era things. And I would expect him to have more secrecy or whatever, right? And he never did it. So, I mean, ironically, he's under the rules of Obama when he could have at any moment changed them to include a line like the president can declassify whatever he wants, whenever he wants. He can't be prosecuted for it. He could have put that in when he was president. He clearly didn't. And so that to me is a little bit surprising. But I don't think anything about our system is that great. It's a little bit ironic that Trump is getting caught up in this problem. But part of the problem is the system is a very strange one and a very old one in many ways, and one that is not that transparent and doesn't allow Congress to have as much of a voice as they probably ought to, and so on and so on.
Alex, fascinating conversation as always. Thank you so much. And to our listeners who want to learn more about restricted data, get the book, Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the USA. Thank you so much, Alex, for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based band 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.